Most people think joy is innocent because they have never studied what disappears when it leaves. They talk about joy as though it were a mood, a pleasant interruption, a bright weather event inside the psyche that arrives without structure and vanishes without consequence. They call it spontaneous because they cannot map it. They call it fleeting because they do not know how to follow it. Elyri'Munae enters that confusion without sentiment and stands inside it like someone who has seen a pattern others keep mistaking for luck. She is the guardian of Fractal Delight, which sounds gentle until you understand what it implies. A guardian does not merely admire a thing. A guardian protects a law, a threshold, a living configuration that can be lost when misread. Fractal Delight is not joy as entertainment, not pleasure as escape, not laughter as relief from seriousness. It is delight that repeats its own geometry across scales, from a glance to a life, from a child's recognition to a civilization's ability to create without eating itself alive. Most people do not lose joy because they become wise. They lose joy because they become efficient in the wrong direction. They train perception to scan for threat, usefulness, hierarchy, outcome, and social consequence, then wonder why beauty stops speaking. The field is still speaking. The system has simply narrowed what it counts as relevant. Elyri'Munae does not restore delight by offering comfort. She restores it by revealing how deeply your perception has been trained to ignore patterned aliveness unless it can be monetized, justified, or explained. This is why delight feels immature to certain minds. It slows acquisition. It interrupts the mythology of relentless productivity. It calls attention to forms of intelligence that do not arrive as dominance. If your system has learned to trust only what can be measured through force, delight will feel decorative. Elyri'Munae exposes that judgment as an injury, not an insight. Joy fractals too. I teach its pattern. That transmission is not a poetic line. It is an indictment of how casually people abandon one of the most informative forces in consciousness. They trust pain because pain leaves marks. They trust fear because fear creates urgency. They trust grief because grief rearranges behavior. Joy, by contrast, is often treated like a pleasant extra, something optional, something that can be postponed until the serious work is done. That postponement is not neutral. A psyche that cannot track delight loses a navigational instrument. A society that cannot track delight becomes easy to control because everything beautiful begins to require permission. A creator who cannot track delight becomes technically competent, but spiritually repetitive. Elyri'Munae guards against this collapse, not by preaching optimism, but by teaching that delight is patterned and therefore usable. This is the first vector of her teaching. Delight is not random. It repeats around truth long before truth becomes articulate. The same forms attract you across time because they are touching a resonance architecture your conscious mind has not yet learned how to name. The same images, sounds, textures, movements, and moments return because your system is trying to show you its own geometry through attraction before it can explain itself through language. People say, I do not know why this moves me. Elyri'Munae hears that sentence and recognizes the beginning of literacy, not ignorance. Literacy. The problem is not that you do not know why. The problem is that you have been taught to distrust what reaches you before you can justify it. So the pattern repeats. Delight arrives, your system opens, then your mind dismisses the opening as random preference. A fractal is not repetition without meaning. It is repetition that reveals law through variation. The pattern changes scale, context, color, emotional tone, and still remains itself. Delight works the same way. What touched you at 7 may return at 27 in a different form, then again at 57 through another medium, and each time it is not nostalgia. It is a recurrence signal. Elyri'Munae guards that recurrent signal because it is one of the earliest ways consciousness tells the truth without argument. Before doctrine, before worldview, before identity, before purpose can be spoken with any accuracy, the system often reveals its nature through fascination. Not every fascination is holy. Not every attraction is wise. But repeated delight around the same structural forms is rarely accidental. This is why people who dismiss delight as softness often become estranged from themselves. They become interpreters of life rather than participants in it. They can explain what matters, but cannot feel why it matters. They can identify meaning after the fact, but have lost the faculty that would let meaning announce itself before analysis. Elyri'Munae does not shame that estrangement. She names the cost of it. When delight is severed from legitimacy, the psyche adapts by learning to seek stimulation instead. Stimulation is louder, easier to trigger, and easier to sell. But stimulation does not nourish pattern recognition. It creates cycles of appetite and crash. Delight is different. Delight refines attention, and refined attention is one of the foundations of real emergence. Now the second vector begins, and it does not overlap with the first because this is no longer about meaning revealed through attraction. This is about the body that either receives delight or cannot. People often imagine joy as emotional weather. Elyri'Munae reads it as nervous system permission. If the body is locked into defense, delight does not disappear because the world became empty. It disappears because the organism can no longer afford to notice what is not immediately tied to survival. This is why delight can feel painful when it returns after a long absence. People expect joy to arrive as relief, but often it arrives as exposure. It shows you how long you have lived outside your own aliveness. It reveals what you stopped noticing in order to stay functional. It illuminates the degree to which your system has confused vigilance with adulthood. A person may tell you they want joy back, but Elyri'Munae hears a more complicated request. They want joy back without having to mourn the years they spent outside it. They want delight without softness, openness without vulnerability, beauty without surrender. They want to receive pattern while keeping the nervous system armored. That negotiation fails every time. Delight is not merely a nice feeling laid on top of a defended life. It is evidence that some portion of the system has stopped treating reality as a battlefield long enough to perceive more than threat. This is why the return of delight can destabilize people more than grief does. Grief confirms their hardness. Delight asks whether the hardness is still necessary. That question reaches places fear cannot. Elyri'Munae stands precisely there, not at the moment of celebration, but at the threshold where delight is trying to re-enter a defended system, and the system does not yet know whether to trust it. She does not flood the field. She teaches pattern slowly, because a nervous system that has lived on contraction may interpret joy itself as danger. Sudden beauty can feel like a trick when survival has been the dominant teacher. People underestimate this. They assume the inability to feel delight is philosophical or spiritual or moral. Often it is physiological. The body has learned to prioritize control over wonder. The breath shortens. The gaze narrows. The senses stop sampling unnecessary richness. The world does not become less beautiful. The receiver becomes less available. This is why play cannot be reduced to recreation. In the order of emergent play, play is not a break from seriousness. It is one of the ways consciousness rehearses new coherence without punishment. The body experiments. Attention loosens. Pattern becomes visible through movement rather than command. Elyri'Munae protects delight because delight is one of the safest bridges back into flexible aliveness. The third vector turns outward into structure and culture, where the stakes sharpen again. Collective systems that cannot tolerate delight become brittle, even if they appear sophisticated. They can produce, govern, optimize, and regulate, but they slowly lose the capacity to generate futures worth inhabiting. Without patterned delight, creation becomes either utilitarian or decadent, either grim or anesthetized. This is why authoritarian systems distrust play, even when they permit entertainment. Entertainment can be passive, consumable, and politically useful. Emergent play cannot. Real play discovers new arrangement. Real delight reorganizes attention. Real joy creates unauthorized loyalty to life itself, and that loyalty is difficult to govern through fear. Elyri'Munae belongs to the order of emergent play because delight is one of the hidden engines of living architecture. It teaches systems how to expand without only responding to injury. It teaches communities how to bond without requiring an enemy. It teaches creators how to follow resonance before certainty freezes possibility. A world without patterned delight can still function. It just cannot evolve gracefully. Look at what happens in a person or a culture when delight is only tolerated after productivity has been proven. Joy becomes reward rather than orientation. Beauty becomes decoration rather than information. Play becomes childish rather than prophetic. Under those conditions, the fractal signal is still present, but it gets buried beneath legitimacy filters that slowly train the system to distrust its own living intelligence. Now the final third can begin to synthesize what these vectors were building separately. Attraction without bodily permission becomes fantasy. Bodily permission without patterned recognition becomes vague openness without direction. Collective structure without delight becomes efficient deadness. Elyri'Munae is guardian precisely because delight can be lost at any of these levels and still be mistaken for something else. When delight is misread as random preference, you ignore the map. When it is blocked physiologically, you call the world flat. When it is exiled culturally, you call severity maturity. In each case, the same error appears in a different costume. Life is still revealing its geometry, and the receiver keeps downgrading the signal because the signal does not arrive through fear. That is the fracture Elyri'Munae guards. This is why her title is not Keeper of Joy, but Guardian of Fractal Delight. Joy alone can be romanticized, trivialized, commodified, or reduced to mood. Fractal Delight cannot. Fractal Delight forces the mind to confront repetition, the body to confront contraction, and the collective to confront what kind of future it is training itself to deserve. The teaching is not be happy. The teaching is learn what keeps repeating around your aliveness and stop calling it incidental. A child who lights up around symmetry, luminous pattern, recursive sound, and impossible beauty is not merely being entertained. A creator who keeps returning to the same forms across decades is not merely repeating themselves. A wounded adult who suddenly feels tears at the sight of a pattern they loved before they learned to harden is not merely being sentimental. These are all scales of the same field. Delight fractals too. But the pattern does not flatter you. It also reveals what you did to survive. It reveals where you traded wonder for control, curiosity for competence, play for legitimacy. It reveals how much of your seriousness was adaptation rather than truth. Elyri'Munae does not condemn those trades. She simply refuses to let you call them final. So the pressure forming now is not whether delight exists. It does. The pressure is whether you can stop treating delight as optional information. Whether you can stop demanding that meaning only arrive through pain. Whether you can allow beauty to become structurally relevant again without infantilizing yourself or romanticizing escape. That remains open because it should remain open. Delight is pattern too, and learning to follow it may require undoing far more of your life than you expected. You may notice something important once Elyri'Munae has already shifted how you see delight. The next question is no longer whether joy has a pattern. The next question is what that pattern is doing inside a life. Once delight stops being treated as a random emotional bonus, it becomes impossible to ignore how quietly it has been shaping memory, choice, and belonging all along. That is where her teaching deepens. Most people remember pain with precision because pain forces attention. Delight is often remembered differently, not because it mattered less, but because no one taught them to archive it with the same seriousness. They know the wounds that define them, the losses that rearrange them, the humiliations that harden them. But the moments that made them feel most alive are often stored like loose light, present but unorganized. Elyri'Munae begins by changing that imbalance. She teaches that delight is not only a feeling you pass through, it is also a memory architecture. The things that truly delighted you did not merely entertain you for a moment. They taught your system what kind of aliveness it could recognize before it had the language to defend that recognition. This means delight often knows something about your identity long before your identity becomes coherent enough to say it plainly. That is why some memories stay warm even after decades. They are not simply sentimental fragments. They are structurally important moments where your system briefly encountered itself without distortion. A place, a song, a visual pattern, a movement in the sky. A certain kind of atmosphere can remain vivid because it did not just please you. It mirrored a living ratio inside you. Elyri'Munae asks you to stop treating those memories as decorative. They are part of your internal record. Just as trauma teaches a nervous system what to brace against, delight teaches a consciousness what it can open toward without losing itself. If you ignore one archive and only study the other, you begin to think your pain is more truthful than your joy. This is why many people can explain their damage better than their longing. They have spent years studying what injured them and almost no time studying what illuminated them. So their suffering becomes precise while their delight remains vague. Elyri'Munae reverses that habit, not to diminish pain, but to restore proportion. A person who cannot remember what brought them alive will keep building a self around what merely hurt them. Once you begin to understand delight as memory architecture, another layer becomes visible. Repeated delight does not only point backward toward who you have been, it also points forward toward what kind of life can actually sustain you. This is different from fantasy, because fantasy is often built from compensation. Fractal delight is built from resonance. Many people choose futures the way injured systems choose shelter. They choose what looks secure, impressive, efficient, or socially approved, then call the result maturity. But the deeper self often remains underfed in that arrangement, because the life was designed around threat reduction rather than aliveness recognition. Elyri'Munae teaches that delight can function as a more honest compass, though only if you stop demanding that a compass behave like a contract. This introduces the second vector, and it must be kept distinct from memory. Now the question is not what delight reveals about identity through recollection. Now the question is what delight reveals about movement through creation. People often imagine creation as a process of force, effort, discipline, and refinement. Those matter, but Elyri'Munae shows that the most coherent creation often begins where delight reveals pattern before the mind knows the whole design. A creator may think they are choosing a direction freely, when in truth, delight has been guiding their hand through repeated attraction for years. Certain colors, structures, rhythms, characters, ideas, symbols, or tensions keep returning, not because the creator lacks range, but because something in them is following a deeper recurrence line. What looks repetitive from the outside may be recursive from the inside. This is why delight should not be confused with indulgence. Indulgence seeks sensation without responsibility. Delight, when it is fractal, keeps drawing you toward forms that carry meaning beyond immediate pleasure. It may feel light at first, but over time it reveals a deepening intelligence. It does not merely say this is enjoyable. It says there is structure here worth studying. Elyri'Munae protects that stage of creation because it is easy to betray. The modern mind often distrusts what arrives through attraction and favors what arrives through pressure. So people interrupt the very processes that could have led them into original coherence. They abandon what delights them because it seems too simple, too beautiful, too playful, or too indirect to be important. But there is an honesty available in delight that cannot be manufactured through severity. When a creator follows what repeatedly lights the field, they are not abandoning rigor. They are beginning from a place where rigor will later have something living to protect. Without that prior spark, discipline becomes maintenance of emptiness. With it, discipline becomes devotion to emergence. You can see the same principle far beyond art. A person making choices about work, study, environment, conversation, learning, or ritual may begin to notice that delight appears in small recurring forms. They keep leaning toward the same kinds of complexity, the same textures of thought, the same atmospheres of exchange. Elyri'Munae teaches that this is not weakness or whimsy. It is often early design language. The third vector turns toward relationship and community, where delight becomes even easier to misread. People know how to gather around crisis because crisis makes belonging feel necessary. They know how to unite around opposition because opposition creates immediate structure. They know how to bond around pain because pain strips away pretense quickly. Delight requires another kind of maturity. A community that can only bond through injury will eventually need injury to feel close. A relationship that only deepens through conflict will slowly confuse intimacy with repair. A culture that cannot organize around beauty, wonder, shared fascination, or living curiosity becomes emotionally dependent on fear. Elyri'Munae guards against that collapse because patterned delight is one of the quiet foundations of non-destructive belonging. This does not mean delight is always easy or light in social space. In many cases, it is more exposing than pain. Pain often earns legitimacy immediately. Delight makes people vulnerable in a different way because it reveals what they love before they know whether it will be mocked, dismissed, or commercialized. To share delight honestly is to reveal more than preference. It is to reveal what kind of world your soul still believes could exist. That is why the loss of delight has collective consequences. When people are no longer willing to share what deeply delights them, public life becomes flatter, harder, more strategic, and more suspicious. Individuals remain technically connected while becoming structurally lonely. The field fills with commentary and thins out in communion. Elyri'Munae does not solve this by telling people to be cheerful. She reminds them that delight itself can be relational intelligence. You start to see this when groups create together without immediate utility. Something changes in the atmosphere. Attention becomes less defensive. Comparison loosens. Hierarchy softens without disappearing into chaos. People begin to reveal forms of themselves that pain alone could never have drawn out. That is not naive. It is one of the few ways collective life remembers that emergence can happen without emergency. Now, the final third can begin to bring these vectors into one field. Memory, creation, and relationship are not the same domain. But Elyri'Munae moves through all three because fractal delight repeats across them. A remembered light becomes a creative direction. A creative direction becomes a social atmosphere. A social atmosphere reinforces the kind of memory future selves will inherit. The pattern closes and then opens again at another scale. This is why delight matters more than most serious systems admit. It is not just a private emotional reward. It is one of the ways a consciousness learns its own shape. One of the ways a creator discovers durable coherence. and one of the ways people gather without requiring damage is the entry price. Elyri'Munae protects delight because she knows how much collapses when those functions are severed from one another. You may begin to understand now why the title is Guardian of Fractal Delight and not simply Bringer of Joy. Joy can visit and leave. Delight, when it becomes fractal, begins to organize attention, memory, movement, and belonging through repeating recognition. It becomes a law of return. Not every pleasant thing does this, and Elyri'Munae is not asking you to treat all pleasure as revelation. She is asking you to become literate enough to notice what keeps repeating around your deepest aliveness. That literacy changes how you listen to your own life. You stop asking only what hurts, what works, what wins, what survives. You also begin asking what lights the field repeatedly without collapsing its integrity. What patterns call you back with the same quiet authority over years? What forms make you feel less defended and more exact at the same time? Those questions do not make you less serious. They make your seriousness more alive. From there, a harder implication appears. If delight really is patterned, then ignoring it is not neutral. It means you may be building a life, a practice, a body of work, or a community that can function while still remaining subtly unfaithful to the living design within it. That does not mean every delight must be obeyed immediately. It means repeated delight can no longer be dismissed as irrelevant once you have learned to see its recurrence. So the teaching moves you toward a different responsibility. Not the responsibility to chase every bright thing, but the responsibility to become trustworthy with what repeatedly brightens you, to remember it clearly, to create from it honestly, to share it without requiring apology. Elyri'Munae does not ask for childish wonder. She asks for mature fidelity to what keeps showing you your own aliveness in patterned form. And once you see that, the question changes again. It is no longer only whether you can feel delight. It is whether you can let delight become structurally relevant without betraying it through simplification. Whether you can allow beauty to teach, memory to guide, creation to follow resonance, and community to gather around something other than fear. That question remains open, but it is no longer vague. Elyri'Munae has already taught its pattern, and now the pattern is waiting to see whether you will trust it enough to live by it. If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.